Thomas Wolfe was one of the most acclaimed authors of the early 20th century. His last novel was published in the 1940s, and it was entitled You Can't Go Home Again. It tells the story of George Webber, who's written a best-selling novel, and it's full of characters based on real people from his hometown and his family. George returns home, expected to be greeted with acclaim, but instead he's confronted with outrage and anger. His lifelong friends and family members feel that George, in his novel, has ridiculed them, that he's exposed their weaknesses, their faults, and their foibles. Their scorn drives George away from home. Now an outcast, George Webber begins a search for his own identity, and he realizes, and I quote, "You can't go back home to your family, back home to your childhood, back home to a young man's dreams of glory and fame, back home to places in the country, back home to the old forms and systems of things which once seemed so everlasting, but which are changing all the time, back home to the escapes of time and memory." In the Bible and in ancient and modern literature and mythology and theater and film, there is a reason why this yearning to go home again is such a common theme. Finding home, I believe, is another way of saying finding peace. It's all tied up in the notion of our life as being a journey, of being forced to grow up and understand that the world is not a perfect place. The constant of change, the challenge of understanding ourselves and our place in the world, and the desire to find acceptance and purpose and security and love. Now, even if you've never physically moved away from the place where you were born, the longing to find home, to find peace, that's still a universal experience. So finding home is not so much about where you live, but knowing who you are. And that's complicated by the fact that we all grow and we all change over our lifespan. It's almost as if we are all on a long road trip and we're peering out the window, watching the landscape of our life passing by, all the relationships, all the work that we've done, the good and the not so good experiences, the triumphs as well as the regrets. And we are changed by everything that we experience. Our perspective changes over time. And hopefully we're enjoying this journey, or at the very least, we're learning from it. And for most of us, as we take that trip, as we travel, even if we're enjoying it, we're still in search of something that feels like home, a sense of security, purpose, acceptance, and peace. Of course, not everyone who literally or figuratively leaves home has the desire to go back, even if they could return and find things just the way they were. Too many of us come from places where we would just as soon never revisit. No one goes through life without emotional or physical bumps and bruises, and many of those injuries are suffered at home, unfortunately. We've been wounded, or we have inflicted wounds, and even those things we've done wrong and would never do again, and even things we've made amends for, those things can still haunt us. Now, even if that's not true for you, most of us, and I dare say all of us, have had moments when what we needed most was a fresh start, a clean slate, second chance. We know that we can't go home again, but we'd sure like to find a place to call home. Several years ago, I lived near Kansas City, and I was at a coffee shop and started chatting with a barista who took my coffee order. He was a young man, and I could tell from his accent that he was not from around there originally. Sure enough, He said he was from Newark, New Jersey. I asked if he was a college student because I thought, well, maybe he'd come all that way to study farming or jazz, or he just loved great barbecue. But this young man was not there to go to school, and he had no family there, no ties whatsoever. And he told me that was the whole point. He told me he needed to get away. He wanted to go to a place where no one back in New Jersey would ever imagine or even think to look for him. So one day he had pulled out a map of the United States, and he closed his eyes and he put his finger right smack dab in the middle of the country. And he went there and he got off the bus, found a job as a barista, and he told me he was starting over, second chance. He was a little vague about why he needed that chance in the first place. It had something to do with what he called family issues back home. I did not ask him if I thought he would ever go back home again. At that point, it didn't appear he even wanted to. Either that or it might not have been an option. I asked him if he was happy. He said, yeah, I'm learning to be happy. And he gestured to his coworkers. He said, I've got good friends here. They're like my family. And that's what matters. So searching for home, I think, is the same as searching for a life of peace and wholeness wherever that might be found. Finding acceptance, purpose, security, and love. At one point, maybe at many times in our lives, we can feel as if we have lost those things, and finding home again can be, for some of us, finding it for the very first time, because we didn't know that such a place ever existed, or it may have just lived in our imagination. But as people of faith, during this season in particular, we proclaim loudly every year that such a place, in fact, does occur. Prophet Isaiah also made that claim. The people of Israel had been living in captivity in Babylon. They'd been forced to live as refugees in that foreign land for almost 70 years, very far away from home, away from the land that had been promised to them by God. Well into their second generation of being away from home, they were desperate to return and restore and reclaim and rediscover their lives. And in our passage today, Isaiah tells the people to take comfort. In the wilderness of their lives, he says, a voice is crying out, and the voice proclaims, a highway is being built. A highway will be built for you to return home. And eventually they did. They returned and they rebuilt their temple in Jerusalem, and they were given a brand new chance to reclaim their lives, to find peace and wholeness. And 600 years later, the writers of the Gospels found a striking parallel to that voice in the wilderness in the person of John the Baptist, also preparing the way, also proclaiming that someone was coming who would once again lead people home. And of course, that someone was Jesus. When we think about why Jesus came into the world, we so often just take this for granted, but why he was born, the quick and easy and traditional answer is to say, to save us. That's what all the Christmas carols say. But I think it's worth asking, to save us from what? You know, when I was growing up, a common way to think about that was to say that there were two types of people. There were people out there who were found and people who were lost. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. I once was lost, rather, but now am found. As much as I adore the hymn, Amazing Grace, it can make it sound as if there really are two distinct categories of people, the lost and the found, meaning those who have embraced faith and those who have not. The problem with that, I think, is what happens when you count yourself among the found in a religious sense, but you still feel lost. Does that mean you're not faithful quite enough? And are we really supposed to be in the business of presuming to label anyone as lost if they just don't happen to believe in the same things that we do? Is that our prerogative? I don't think it's my prerogative to categorize anyone as lost or found. If nothing else, I've simply known way too many Christians who feel terribly lost. And on the other hand, plenty of people who are not Christians who are among the most found people I've ever met. So when we talk about being lost and being saved from being lost, what does that even begin to mean? Additionally, what we'd say is it looks like being in a relationship with God through Christ. That's being found. We'd say that finding home, finding peace means that we are connected with God in a covenant relationship. But my question is, how exactly is that covenant connection made real? How does finding home go from being a religious belief or a mystical concept or a theory or a dream to being a flesh and blood concrete reality? How does someone get found? No matter what religious beliefs they may or may not have, how does anyone arrive at home? I believe it happens right here. It happens wherever we find relationships that heal and restore us. And when we are given the opportunity to provide healing and restoration for other people, and we see that as our reason for being as a church, it happens when we're able to know ourselves. And I strongly believe, I really do, we best get to know ourselves, not in isolation, but in community. For so many of us, the greatest challenge of the COVID pandemic was not necessarily the threat of serious illness, as real as that was, and continues to be. The greatest challenge and the lingering emotional toll has been all about isolation, loneliness, the loss of being with others in meaningful ways. Now, technology like Zoom is now understood as a handy tool. But do you remember when the pandemic first descended? Zoom felt like you were being handed a lifeline. You know, it's kind of funny to see people in little Brady Bunch-like boxes. That took a while to get used to, didn't it? But for many people, that might have been their only way to have any kind of meaningful connection at all with other people. We need connection because we need others to hold a mirror up to us so that we can discover who we are, so that we can be our best selves, so that we can know what it means to belong. For me, and I hope for you too, that is the value of a church. It's incredibly significant. It's why this place matters, and it's why it will continue to matter right here, if nowhere else in the world, nowhere else in people's lives. We create a community that is a home place, a place of belonging, a place of peace, a place where our covenant connection with God is made real in the faces and the names and the hugs and the laughter and the tears and the music. A place that's rare among churches, this place is, because we welcome all comers. We don't require anyone to pass a test of faith to belong here. Whatever you happen to believe, every Sunday, when we affirm, when we say out loud that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here, that is what that statement means. Here, you can be lost, you can be found, or something in between. We welcome you. And that is our gift to the community, to be a place where you can be found. That's wonderful. And we're all on that spectrum anyway. Come on, that statement is not just about other people, it's about you and me. We're all seeking and creating and living out what being found looks like. I think it looks like us together right now. It's made real in working together and rejoicing together, grieving together, and hoping and praying and learning and serving others together. And in doing those things, finding acceptance and peace and purpose and security and love. It's made real in sharing the journey we're all on of finding peace in our lives and discovering that place of peace in God through each other. Think about passing the peace of Christ with one another. That's just a small example of a larger reality. 35 years ago, I lived in a little bitty town called Elgin, Texas, population 6,000. And like all small Texas towns, the Dairy Queen was located right on the main highway and was the social hub. One morning before going to work, I stopped in to have some. I was not a big fan of Dairy Queen, but it was the only place open at 6:30 a.m. And Elgin definitely did not have a Starbucks, so I didn't have any options anyway. But seated at a group of tables right near the front door was a collection of 8 or 9 men of retirement age, farmers and ranchers, leisurely drinking coffee and eating biscuits and gravy. They looked like a bunch of characters straight out of an old Western movie. It was great. I sat nearby and I eavesdropped on their conversation while I pretended to read a newspaper. It became really evident very fast that these men had known each other for years. They had these names: Skinny, Pee-wee, Chester. Apparently, these gentlemen held court at Dairy Queen every weekday morning, and there they would gently tease each other and exchange gossip and remark on the weather and talk local politics. At times, they told corn off-color jokes and laughed loud, but they also shared somber news of friends' illnesses or a neighbor's misfortune, and then they would become reflective and quiet. I realized that what these men had going on was a significant sense of belonging. They cared about each other. Over a morning cup of coffee at Dairy Queen, they were safe, they were accepted, and they were very much at home. And for me, it conjured up an odd mix of feelings. I felt glad for them that they had that sense of community, but I was also really envious. It reminded me of what I was searching for and had been all my life. I've always had the yearning to seek and create and live in a meaningful community with other people. Now, it's not that those things have been absent in my life. Thankfully, I've been very lucky to have that. But the desire is still there to find home, to find peace. And I'm always reminded during this season when I hear those familiar words spoken from Scripture, the promise of a way that has been built for me, that at any time I find myself in the wilderness of life, that there's always a way home. When I hear the familiar Christmas carols that remind me back when I was very small during a Christmas Eve service, standing on a pew next to my mother, holding my candle up high and singing Silent Night, that sure felt like home. And on any given Sunday, when I'm in the presence of such a warm and welcoming community of faith as this one is, I'm reminded that home and peace are already very present in my life, and that God is always with me. That this beloved community is a home place, a place of both seeking home and finding home and peace. I am so grateful that you have called me here to serve you. Thank you for that privilege. And with your help, I want to continue what this church has been already doing for decades to make sure that this is a place where everyone who is seeking home, everyone who may feel lost or found or something in between, everyone yearning for peace, That's our sacred calling. You're probably familiar with a poem by T.S. Eliot. I think it expresses pretty well why we're here. He wrote, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." Amen.